few months ago, we were just living our lives normally. My sister called me crying. She said, "Mom and Dad, they died in a car accident." All of a sudden, all the dreams that we had, all the plans were just scattered. This big fear was coming inside of me. In Brazil, when someone dies, everything happens within 24 hours, and I was panicking that I couldn't be there for my parents' funeral.
Really, our only thought was we need to get there.
Yeah.
And that her sister was alone, trying to manage all of this alone. We wanted to be with her. We just left in a hurry. We threw what we could into bags, and we left for the airport in a rush and flew to Brazil. We were just afraid we would arrive too late and that she wouldn't be able to see her parents, that we would miss that, and that she wouldn't be able to say goodbye.
To see my children crying was so hard. I was thinking and asking God, why? Why did you let this happen?
Ben and Claudia serve on our staff here at Parker Hill, and our hearts have been heavy as we have watched them walk through this incredible tragedy. And yet at the same time, I've been very encouraged as I've watched them draw on the strength of their relationship with God and their relationship with each other. And I really appreciate them being willing to share their story, and we'll hear a little bit more of their story at the end of our time together today. But did you hear the question that Claudia was asking? It's the question that all of us ask when life is falling apart. Why? Why me? Why this? Why now? Why? We've been in this series called Insomnia, and over the last 4 or 5 weeks, we've been wrestling with some of the big questions of life, those questions that we find ourselves thinking about at 2 o'clock in the morning when we're wide awake, staring at the ceiling. And today, in the final week of this series, we are addressing and wrestling with this question: why is this happening to me? In other words, if God is real, and if God loves me, then why is there so much pain in my life? And maybe you've found yourself asking this question. Maybe you've been asking this question recently. Maybe you were asking this question after a doctor came into the waiting room and said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do." Or when your spouse came home and said, "It's over, I've found somebody else." Or maybe you're a middle school or high school student and you've been asking this question because your family is in so much turmoil, because there's so much tension and so much conflict, and you're saying, "Why is this happening to me?" Or maybe you broke up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend and you're feeling that pain of rejection. Or maybe you haven't asked this question because of one single event, one single circumstance in your life. Maybe for you it's just a collection of disappointments over a period of time because of all the dreams that you had that haven't come true. For some of you hearing this message, maybe you're not struggling with this question right now, but maybe you know someone who is, and it's somebody that you care about. And they're asking, "Why is this happening to me?" And you don't have an answer for them. And maybe God brought you here today just so that you would be able to learn some words of comfort that you can then offer to them. But see, here's what I've discovered. Whenever we begin asking this question, there are two answers that we commonly come up with. Both answers are completely false. We say, "Well, this is happening because God doesn't care." Or we say, "Well, this is happening because God isn't there." In other words, this is happening because God is there, but He doesn't really give a rip about my life. Or this is happening because I was wrong and God doesn't even exist to begin with. And so when you find yourself in circumstances where you're wrestling with this question, "Why is this happening to me?" and you're tempted to believe one of these two lies, let me give you a principle that you can fall back on. Let me give you a statement that you can hang on to. It's this: that the presence of pain does not prove the absence of love. The presence of pain does not prove the absence of love. And I believe that anyone who's been a parent for any length of time understands this principle. Because sometimes as parents, we allow our kids to feel pain, and it's not because we don't love them. In fact, I've told you several times about what happened 15 years ago when my youngest daughter was a year old, and we had to admit her into the hospital for 3 days so she could be treated for an infection. And 15 years later, I still remember holding her down on the examining room table while a nurse put a catheter in her body, and when they put a needle in her arm for the IV. And for 3 days, my wife and I would hold her while they came and drew blood from her body twice a day. And see, the pain in her body was not evidence of an absence of our love for her. In fact, we loved her deeply and felt her pain with her and were right there beside her, because the presence of pain does not prove the absence of love. And I want you to remember this principle the next time you ask yourself that question, why is this happening to me? We're going to unpack this idea today from the words of a man who understood very deeply what it meant to struggle with disappointment and doubt in the face of God. So I want to encourage you to locate Psalm 77 in your Bible or bring it up on your mobile device, Psalm 77. And let me encourage you also to take out that connection card that you received when you came in. Great place there to take some notes. And if you're watching online, just grab a pen or a paper, because there may be some things that God impresses upon your heart that you may want to write down. Now, before we jump into Psalm 77, and while you're finding it and getting out that connection card, let me just tell you what's going to be happening next week. Take about 2 minutes to tell you about this series that begins next week. Next week, we're beginning this series called Labeled. And here's the idea behind it. As we go through life, people give us labels. Your parents may have given you some labels. Kids at school may have given you a label. Sometimes we give ourselves labels. Sometimes they're positive. Most of the time, they're negative. And it's funny, the ones we remember the most are the negative ones. But then those labels, they begin to define us. We begin to live up or down to those labels. But here's the thing. God, the Father, invites us into a relationship with Him through His Son. And when we enter into that relationship, we're given a new identity. And the Scripture gives all of these labels or these names or these titles for followers of Christ, for God's people, like, sons and daughters and conquerors. And Jesus said, you are the branch and I'm the vine. And so we're going to talk about 6 labels that God gives to us, because when you know who you are, you will know what to do. So I'm looking forward to that series. It's going to be great. Starts next week. It'll go for 6 weeks. I think it's going to be both encouraging and challenging for you. And I would encourage you to invite somebody to come along with you who doesn't have a church to attend. We'll give you some invite cards on your way out today. But let's jump in for this week on this final series, this final question. Psalm 77 is where our attention is going to be focused. And as I've said every week, the Psalms in that part of the Bible, these 150 Psalms, are Jewish Hebrew poetry, prayers that were written by God's people, and some of them were set to music and became their worship songs. And it's amazing. I've just been reminded how amazing it is that these words written hundreds of years ago still speak so accurately to the deepest questions of our hearts. And one of the things I love about the Psalms is that they model for us what it looks like to dispense with, the polite, sanitized God talk that we sometimes use, and just pour out our hearts to God. And Psalm 77 is one of those. It's written by a guy named Asaph, and we don't know what he was going through, but he went through a season of disappointment and doubt, and then he comes out the other side of it and kind of gives us his personal journal as he describes where he was and how he came out the other side. So as I begin reading, I want you to listen, because I believe that God has something to say to every single person hearing this message. Asaph says this. He says, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. Asaph says, God, I called out to you. I called out to you in the daytime. I called out to you at night. I prayed to you, God, and it just feels like you didn't answer me. So Asaph is feeling as if God didn't respond to him, as if God wasn't listening, as if God had turned a deaf ear to him. I heard a story years ago about an elderly, affluent grandfather who went to a hearing specialist because he had completely lost his hearing several years before that. And the doctor gave him the best and latest hearing device to correct his hearing loss. And he said to him, I believe that once you begin using this, you will hear everything with perfect clarity. And so this elderly, affluent grandfather goes home and comes back a month later for his checkup. And the doctor said, well, how's it working? And the guy says, it's working incredibly well. I can hear absolutely everything. And the doctor said, well, I'm so glad. And your family must also be excited for this breakthrough in your life. And the old guy says, well, I haven't told my family. I've just been listening to them for a month. And I've changed my will 4 times, he says. That's how it is sometimes in our relationship with God, I think. God hears every cry for help. But sometimes on our side of things, it feels like he isn't listening. It feels like he's turned a deaf ear to us. That's how Asaph felt. I wonder if you've ever felt that way. He goes on to say this in verse 4. He says, you kept my eyes from closing. He says, God, because of what you allowed to happen in my life, I lie in bed and I stare at the ceiling. There's so much turmoil in my heart, I can't even sleep. He says, I was too troubled to speak. In other words, the pain was so deep I couldn't even put it into words. It was just too difficult to talk about. He says, I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. He says, God, I remembered the days when I stayed up all night, but I stayed up all night singing. Now I stay up all night crying. And God, I miss those days. I mean, do you hear the raw emotion? Do you hear the pain in those words? And have you ever found yourself in a situation like that? Do you know someone who's ever been in a situation like that where the pain is so deep you can't escape it? And the pain is so deep that you can't even express it with words? Let me stop here and point something out. Can I tell you what I find so interesting about this? The guy who wrote these words, Asaph was not a spiritual rookie. In fact, in another part of the Bible, it tells us that Asaph was the chief musician for the people of Israel. In other words, Asaph was like Kurt Mocha on our Clark Summit campus. Asaph was like, if you attend the Wilkes-Barre campus, Asaph was the Cricky of his day. Or, for those of you on the Dixon City campus, Asaph was like the Zach Rollison for the people of Israel. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Asaph had the same beard that Zach has that I'm very jealous of. But he was the guy who would lead the people in worship, Asaph was. And yet he was the guy who was struggling with disappointment and doubt. And it's a reminder that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how long you've walked with God. None of us are exempt from experiencing the dark night of the soul. I remember when I was a kid growing up in church, we had this hymn, we had this song that we used to sing, and the lyrics went something like this: every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before. Now, I don't know who wrote that song, and I don't mean to offend you if you like that song. That song's ridiculous. That is not reality. Because the truth is, even for the follower of Christ, there are days in this world when the pain is deep because this world is so broken. In fact, remember how Jesus described this world in John chapter 16? He said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And what Christians like to do is they like to focus on the promise at the end of the verse, I have overcome the world, but we tend to neglect the promise that Jesus made in the front part of that verse, that in this world you will have trouble. You will. And if the trouble is deep enough, and if the trouble goes on long enough, you will begin to doubt the very heart of God toward you. And this is where Asaph found himself. At the end of verse 6, he says this. He says, my heart meditated, and my spirit asked. In other words, he says, this is where my thoughts began to go. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? God, why is this happening to me? I mean, these are real, honest questions that disappointed people struggle with. What do you do when you find yourself there, filled with disappointment, filled with doubt, asking those kinds of questions? Can I tell you what most people do, or at least many people? Many people give up on God. They give up on faith. They give up on church because they find it so hard to reconcile the idea of a loving God with the pain that they're experiencing in their life or the pain that they're seeing around them. And so they draw the conclusion, God must not care or God's not even there. Now, fortunately, Asaph doesn't end up there. He kind of turns the corner, and Psalm 77 fortunately doesn't end at verse 9, because Asaph, after he hits bottom emotionally and spiritually, then there's this turning point, and begins in verse 10. And I want to show you how that turning point takes place. There's this two-word phrase that's repeated 3 times in these 3 verses. Verse 10, I will. Verse 11, I will. Verse 12, I will. In other words, he comes to this point where he decides to do something, where he makes a choice, where he no longer operates just out of emotion. Now he operates out of volition, and he says, I will appeal, I will remember, I will meditate. Do you see what he's doing? He's choosing intentionally to refocus his thoughts and to refocus his attention. And he's beginning to tell himself the truth. And I think one of the best things that we can do whenever we begin to slide into despair and when we begin to slide into doubt is we reframe our thoughts, refocus our attention, and then we begin to preach a different message to ourselves. And we tell our mind to speak to our hearts. And we begin to speak words of truth and words of life instead of words of death. It's kind of like a guy who was in a shopping mall with his 2-year-old son, and the mall was crowded and it was noisy, and they had been in there for a couple of hours, and this little 2-year-old guy, he's kind of worn out, and he starts to cry, and he starts to fuss, he starts to create a little bit of a scene, and then his father starts saying in a real calm voice, it's okay, Danny, you can do this, Danny, just be patient, Danny. It's okay, Danny, you can do this, Danny, just be patient, Danny. And somebody comes up to him and says, is your son Danny having a hard day? And he says, my son's name is Jack. My name is Danny. It's okay, Danny. Just be patient, Danny. You can do it, Danny. And you know what we need to do sometimes? When we're overwhelmed with doubt and despair, we just need to begin to speak a different message to ourselves. We need to get our attention off of our circumstances, off of our problems, because the ability to cope in times of distress often comes down to how you talk, what you say to yourself and what you say to God. And so what Asaph does at this point is he decides to stop talking about his problems and he begins talking about his God. And he turns this corner in verse 10 and he says, then I thought, to this I will appeal. The years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. The right hand in Jewish scripture always referred to God's authority and God's power. And Asaph says, I love this word he uses here, the years. He says, I'm going to stop focusing on this week and this month. I'm going to stop focusing on this season of pain that I'm in. I'm going to step back and I'm going to see, not right now, but I'm going to see the years when the Most High stretched out his hand. I'm going to get perspective. And then he goes on to say this in verse 11. He says, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider, what's that next word? All your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, God, I'm choosing not to judge you by the immediate circumstances of my life. God, I'm not going to make up my mind about your heart and your character by what I'm experiencing right now in this little season of pain in my life. I'm going to step back, I'm going to see the years, and I'm going to see all your mighty works, and I'm going to see all your deeds, and I want to look at all of that. He's stepping back, looking across history, reminding himself of the truth about who God really is. It's kind of like something I used to do with my kids when they were younger. I have 2 girls, and when they were kids, we really enjoyed building stuff with Legos. I grew up with Legos, but I grew up in a simpler time. And when I grew up, Legos were very simple. They were just rectangles and squares, and there were 6 different colors, and that was it. But have you been in Toys R Us lately? Have you seen Legos now? I mean, they've got stuff like this. This is the Heart Lake Grand Hotel. I mean, this is awesome. This is incredible. So you go into Toys R Us with your kids, with your daughters, and you say, honey, look at this is awesome. Like, we're going to buy this, and we're going to drive the Lego taxi around, and we're going to pick up the people, and we're going to take like the little Lego poodle, and we're going to put it in one of the rooms, and we're going to ride the elevator up and down to the guest rooms in the Lego hotel. And so you buy this thing, right? And then you bring it home. Then reality hits. Right? Because see, you didn't buy the picture. You bought pieces. 1,552 pieces to be exact. And there's big pieces, and there's small pieces, and there's pretty pieces, and there's plain pieces, and there's pieces like I don't even know what the pieces are for. And I've thought to myself, this is like a metaphor for life right here. This is your first year of marriage. Right? Right? Like all the newly married people, they're not saying anything right now, but you've got this image in your mind of what marriage is going to be, but then you realize there's a lot of pieces to this thing, and there's some assembly required. This is like parenting, right? Because parenting, you got this image in your mind of how you're going to raise a kid, and you're like, I'm going to raise a world changer. Okay, change a diaper. Here's what I've learned about life. Life comes to us in pieces. It does. But you know what can happen? We can no longer see the picture because we get so focused on the piece. And some of you, you're at a point in your life where you're ready to give up on the picture, or you've already given up on the picture because you can't see past the piece. And Asaph says, God, I'm going to choose to step back and no longer focus on this piece in my life, this season of pain. I want to see the big picture. I want to see the creator, the designer. God, I want to see you. And so this is what he does. And he says in verse 13, your ways, O God, are holy. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. See, he's no longer the focus of his attention. His problems, his disappointments, his challenges, that's no longer the focus of his attention. Now he's focused his attention on the God who's bigger than all of those things. He's stepped back away from the piece. He's seeing the picture. Tim Keller wrote a book, excellent book called The Reason for God, and he has an entire chapter on the question of evil and suffering in this world, chapter 2. And he says something in this chapter that I think is absolutely profound. He says this. He says, if you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering in this world, then you have at the same time a God who is great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing it to continue, reasons that you can't know. And so Asaph says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to step back, and I'm not just going to look at the piece. I'm going to look at the picture. I'm going to look at the God who has it all under his authority. And then what Asaph does in the last 6 verses here of this psalm that he wrote, he describes a specific moment, a defining moment in the history of the people of Israel. And some of you may be familiar with this story, but he begins this way. In verse 15, he says, God, with your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The skies resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea. Your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. I love that phrase. He says, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Do you know what he's describing? He's describing a very particular event, a defining moment in the history of the nation of Israel. It was after they had been held as slaves in Egypt for 400 years that eventually they were freed from that slavery through a series of plagues. And God did a little bit of divine arm twisting with the king, the Pharaoh, and he let the people go. But they left, and then it wasn't very long before he realized that he had lost all his free labor. And so he sends his armies out after them. He sends his chariots and his armies with swords and spears to hunt them down. And as they're coming after the people of Israel, what happens to the people of Israel? They run right up against the Red Sea. And do you know what they did then? They freaked out. Listen to this. Exodus 14, go back to the story in Exodus. The Egyptians, all the Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea. The Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. Remember, the Israelite people, they had no weapons. They had been slaves. They had no weapons, and these guys had chariots and swords and spears. And it says they were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. And then it goes on to say this. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Can I ask you something? Have you ever wondered if maybe you made a mistake by following God? Have you ever thought that maybe you'd be better off if you hadn't followed God? And I know some of you are thinking, well, no, I would never do that. All right, you polish your halo for a moment while I talk to all the real people in the room, okay? Like, you know, you're in business and you're doing business ethically and honestly, and you're doing it the right way, and then somebody else who's dishonest and unethical gets promoted past you. And you're wondering, you know, God, why have I followed you this far? Or let me talk to all the single ladies on every campus. All the single ladies. Maybe, you know, you've said, you know what, God, I'm going to find a husband, a man in the church, because I know that's the place to find a man who's going to be godly, who's going to lead my home. And you've been trying that for a while, and now you're thinking, you know, maybe, God, if I just stuck with the club, I'd be married by now. And I'm trying to be pure, and I'm trying to do it right, and I'm trying to do it your way, but nothing's happening. Or maybe you forgive someone, and then they take advantage of you, and you think, well, maybe I should have just acted like the rest of the world and not been so forgiving. I think that's how the people of Israel felt. They're out here, and as far as they can tell, this is the end. This is it. It is over. They're either going to die by the sword or they're going to die by drowning. But that wasn't the end. You know what that was? That was a piece. It was just a piece. There was a bigger picture that God was writing, because you probably know what happens next, right? So God divides the Red Sea. The people of Israel march through it safely, and God in the process wipes out the entire Egyptian army. I mean, it's just an epic story. You go to the end of chapter 14, it says the water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. This is what Asaph is referring back to. He's referring back to this defining moment in the history of the Jewish people, and he looks back and he says, you know, there have been times in the past when it seemed like all hope was gone. He says, there have been times in the past when it seemed as if God had forgotten his people. He said, God, there have been times in the past when it seemed like you abandoned us, but when we saw the bigger picture, we realized that you were right there all along. And so Asaph says, I'm going to choose to believe that you also are with me right here, right now. Asaph says, I'm going to stop looking at the piece. I'm going to look across time. I'm going to see the bigger picture of a God who is always faithful. And do you know what we need to do? When the question comes, why is this happening to me? And when we're tempted to believe either God does not care or he is not there, we got to remind ourselves that the presence of pain does not prove the absence of love. And we get our eyes off the piece and we step back and we see the bigger picture and we get perspective. Let me tell you how you do that. 2 ways. You have to look back and you have to look ahead. We look back and we look at the cross, right? Because if there was ever a time in human history when it seemed as if God was absent, I mean, that was the moment. If you and I had been there that day, standing on that hillside outside the city of Jerusalem, we would have seen that man on that center cross, a man who had fed the hungry and healed the sick and loved the outcast, a man who had done nothing wrong, a man who wasn't even really a man. He was the Son of God, being crucified like a common criminal. And he died on that cross, and then by the end of the day, his lifeless body was buried in a cold tomb, and a stone was rolled in front of it, and the Roman government put their seal on it, and soldiers were put there to guard it. And I'll tell you what, it seemed so final, it seemed so irreversible, it seemed as if death had won. It seemed like that was the end of the story, that was it. And from a human perspective, it seemed like God was nowhere to be found. But do you know what that was? It was just a piece. Because 3 days later, Easter morning, the stone was rolled away, the soldiers were scattered, the seal was broken, the tomb was empty, Jesus was alive, death was defeated, evil was defeated, and God continued to write a better story and draw a bigger picture. And I'll tell you what, when life is difficult, when you begin to doubt, you get eyeball to eyeball with the cross. And you remember a moment in history when it seemed to all the world as if God was absent, and yet he was very much there. and you look at the cross, because here's the thing, the cross won't necessarily give you the answer to the question, why is this happening to me? But it will tell you what the answer isn't. It'll tell you what the answer can't be. It can't be that God doesn't love you. It can't be that God doesn't care about you, because God cared enough about you to step into human history and to endure suffering and to endure a level of suffering that none of us will ever experience. And he did all of that to rescue us and to give us a place where there will never be suffering again, and to end suffering forever without ending us. You see, the cross itself is the greatest evidence that the presence of pain is not the absence of love, because the greatest pain was also the moment in history when we saw the greatest love. And by the way, there's a card that was on your seat when you came in today. Whenever you need to just refocus your thoughts, you just read this again, Psalm 77:12. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds, not this moment in time, not this peace, but everything. And you look back toward the cross. But then do you know what else you do? You look ahead. You look ahead. You look ahead to that time at the end of human history when everything that's broken in this world will be made whole once again. And we look forward to our hope, because it's in looking forward to our hope that we find joy even in our times of pain. It's kind of like, imagine you find out that you have an uncle that you never knew who was very wealthy, who died and left you millions upon millions of dollars. And then after all the paperwork is completed, you get a call to come to the bank to pick up your huge inheritance, okay? And you're driving to the bank, and half a mile away from the bank, half a mile away, your car breaks down. What do? Do you get out, slam the door, kick the tire, curse God, and envy everybody who's passing by in better cars than yours? I wouldn't. I'd close the door, leave the car there on the side of the road, walk the half a mile to the bank with a smile on my face. In fact, I would skip that half a mile to the bank, and that half mile would be the most joyous walk I've ever taken because of what's waiting for me at the end of that walk. And can I tell you that the walk in this world of following Christ can sometimes be filled with pain and with disappointment. But it can be the most joyful walk that you've ever taken in this world, because of what you know lies at the end of that journey, the eternal reward and the eternal beauty of the kingdom of God that is promised to us. You know, it's like Legos, right? Because there's one thing they give you with the Legos. They give you the book. The instruction book. It's a really handy thing to have when you got 1,552 pieces. But you know what you do? And I'm an experienced Lego builder. When you're at the point where you're tired of putting the pieces together, and when you're frustrated, and you're ready to give up, and you just don't want to keep going, you turn all the way to the end of the book, to page 230. There it is. It's the picture. It's the picture of what it's all going to look like eventually when all the pieces come together. And you see the picture, and you remember that every piece is part of the picture, and so you keep going. Let me turn to the end of the book. Revelation chapter 21, the last book in the Bible. It paints a picture of a time when we will all stand next to our Savior in eternity. And every piece of history and every piece of our lives will finally be put into place. And it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. And they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And he will wipe every tear from their eyes. And there will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' He who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.'" See, I don't know what you're going to face this week. I don't know what you're going home to today. I don't know what the phone call is going to be at 2 o'clock in the morning. But the presence of pain does not prove the absence of love. And in that moment, time, in that season of life that seems so painful, as you're holding that piece, look back, look ahead, and see the picture. I want you to hear one more time from Ben and Claudia. Watch this with me.
I was very angry. I was angry towards that man that hit my parents' car. It's so hard, but I believe that God is giving us grace each day, sometimes just for that hour, sometimes just for 1 minute.
One of the things that I remember reading, I think as we were traveling, going back to Psalm 23, where it talks about the valley of the shadow of death, I remember thinking as we flew that we were living that it was that valley where death casts its shadow over everything, and it touches everything. There's not a single thing that's not hidden.
One thing that I'm learning each day, that pain and peace can coexist. I keep thinking about what Dad wrote in one of his journals, how his trust was in God alone, and that's what I want to keep doing every single day, and teaching my kids that Jesus is enough, even though when you're so much pain.
To me, in the darkness and in the moments of shadow, it felt like God was walking with us, that he didn't need to say anything.
They were just very awesome, and I was just very blessed to have 2 wonderful parents. And she was writing, and just the expression on her face was just so, like, different. And then she wrote something, and she said, I wrote this song, I'm gonna sing it to you when we get home. Like, okay. And then she sang this song that says, I love you, sometimes the skies are gray,
sometimes loved ones are gone.